So I just saw Barbenheimer, and overall the experience was pretty fun. For those of you unaware, this is a double feature of both Barbie and Oppenheimer. Basically, once people realized that these two highly anticipated and tonally juxtaposing films would be released on the same day, it became a bit of a meme, and internet film people decided that there should be a double feature. Now, obviously, other studios are going to try and replicate the success of this motion picture event. Lionsgate recently changed the release date of Saw X so that it's now opening on the same day as the new Paw Patrol movie, and the social media manager on Paramount Pictures is trying desperately to make this a thing. 7 tickets to Saw Patrol, please. Hashtag Saw Patrol. Yeah, nice try. What you don't understand is that both Oppenheimer and Barbie were highly anticipated films regardless of what day they're being released. Many people who discuss film on the internet were excited for Oppenheimer because it's the new Christopher Nolan film. Many people who discuss film on the internet were excited for Barbie because it's the new Greta Gerwig Noah Baumbach film. And even average audience members who don't know who's responsible for creating these films were excited because they're based on things that they're excited to see movies about. Now, I am excited for Saw X, but I don't think most people are. And even the people who are probably not excited for the same reasons I am. But I don't think the target demographic for the new Paw Patrol movie is even old enough to have a Twitter account or be discussing things online at all. I'm not sure how you think you're going to generate any hype or interest here. It's a nice try, but it's also kind of embarrassing. I don't think there's much overlap in the demographic of these two films. Now, I was lucky enough to see Oppenheimer in 70mm IMAX, which is the intended way to watch this film according to Christopher Nolan, even though only 30 theaters in the entire world can do this. When we got to the theater, there was a group of 18-year-olds-ish wearing suits, which is, I guess, what you're supposed to wear to Oppenheimer. And at the Barbie screening, there were a lot of pink clothes. There was also one person that I noticed was at both screenings, and he was dressed as Spider-Man the whole time. I'm not sure why, but that was interesting. It was honestly pretty exciting to feel like I was at an actual movie event. Like, it wasn't a convention or anything. I was at a movie theater, but people excitedly got out of their houses to attend a thing that they wanted to see. There was a great energy in the air. And aside from conventions or film festivals, this isn't really something I've seen since pre-COVID. The movies are back, baby! All right, I guess I'll talk about these movies in the order that I saw them in. I started with Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan. It's a movie. Oppenheimer was pretty good, but it's also one of those movies that I found myself appreciating more than actually enjoying throughout its entire runtime. First off, the performances in this movie were pretty great. I love Cillian Murphy, and it's great to see him taking a leading role in one of Nolan's films after being such a longtime collaborator. He did a really fantastic job with his performance in this film, and I hope that he gets nominated for an Oscar. Everyone else in the cast did a good job with their characters, but Cillian Murphy really stole the show. There was also a surprising amount of notable actors, some of whom only had a few minutes of screen time. Kenneth Branagh, Benny Safdie, Rami Malek, Casey Affleck, Alex Wolff, Josh Hartnett, the guy from The Boys, Josh Peck, Dane DeHaan, and that's not even including the name actors that played main characters like Robert Downey Jr. and Emily Blunt and Florence Pugh and Matt Damon. With the amount of notable and recognizable actors playing minor characters in this film, it kind of gave off the same vibe as watching a movie with a bunch of pop culture references in it. Like, oh hey, it's the guy. Like if it were a cameo appearance in a comedy movie. It was honestly kind of bizarre. Now, I'm sure this goes without saying, but the look of this film was fantastic, and there were some really memorable moments watching it in 70mm IMAX. There was definitely an extra power from seeing certain images taking up the full length of the IMAX screen. The drastic aspect ratio changes did take some getting used to, and even though this isn't the first IMAX film I've seen, its usage in this film came across as a bit gimmicky within the first 20 minutes or so. Thankfully, over the course of the film, I not only got used to it, but I was really into it. So if you're planning on watching this movie anyway, I would really recommend the 70mm IMAX screening if you're able to. The musical score from Ludwig Göransson was really great overall. It had an interesting tone and really powerful presence and composition at points, although I have to admit there definitely were some eye-rolling moments when it came to the score and how it was used in the film. There were definitely some really cliched checklist moments moments, where the score loses all personality and instead decides to do this stereotypical light piano music because it's a sad scene, even though it sounds weirdly familiar and indistinguishable from other films.
You don't get to commit the sin, and then have us all feel sorry for you that it had consequences. You pull yourself together. People here depend on you.
So yeah, aside from some really cliched moments, the score was great overall. It was actually kind of interesting listening to the score for this film, because much of it seemed familiar to other Christopher Nolan films that Hans Zimmer had scored. So it just goes to show as a reminder that different directors will have different levels of control over their composers, or different ideas of what they want, or different levels of creative freedom. Listening to the score and how it was used in this film gave me the impression that Christopher Nolan had a set idea of what he wanted it to sound like, and for most of the film it worked really well. And when I say most of the film, I also mean that the score is playing for almost the entire film. This is one of the most music-heavy non-musicals I've ever seen in my life, to the point where it felt borderline manipulative. Pretty much every single scene in this film is just constantly playing music, and from the very beginning of the film, half of it is edited as if it's a theatrical trailer. It was honestly kind of jarring because it's the very beginning of the movie, you're like 5 minutes into it, and based on how it's presenting itself, it feels like it's coming towards the climax at the end of the film. It's a really immediate sense of heightened emotions without really having earned any of it yet. It goes really hard immediately, and it continues to be edited and presented in this way for quite a while. At around 20 minutes into the movie, I was thinking to myself about how interesting it was that Christopher Nolan was taking this experimental approach, but then it's not really consistent with itself for the entire runtime. Like, half of the movie is just presented and edited like a normal movie, and the other half is presented and edited like a dramatic trailer. It kept switching between. It was very strange, and at points I wish the movie just made up its mind. This was kind of a weird Christopher Nolan film to watch, because within it he's very clearly trying to do these art-housey moments. Like, there are things being shown that are obviously not happening in a literal sense, but when watching these moments in this film, a lot of it comes off as really obvious and silly. Like, you understand the intention, but it's still kind of goofy. Also, nobody talked like a real person. In almost every scene, the dialogue just feels as though it's trying really hard to be in a list of memorable movie quotes. And because of the trailer-style editing for much of the film, it makes for a really jarring experience. Oftentimes in this film, when characters are talking to each other, the editing will overlap their sentences, so they're kind of interrupting each other, which is not inherently a bad thing at all, but the way that this film does it, it just feels so unnatural. There were definitely some weird choices in the editing for conversation scenes. Sometimes it would cut back to a character and only show them for a few frames. Again, there's plenty about the editing and style and pacing of the film that works really well, but there were too many moments that just felt kind of off. Now, I should probably mention that I'm not a huge history buff. I watched this film because it's the new Christopher Nolan film and because it looked like it would be a fun audio-visual experience, but he could have made a movie about anything and I still would have watched it. When it comes to the story of Oppenheimer, there's a lot about it that I really enjoyed. There were some interesting psychological angles about responsibility and the consequences of war. There was a lot of thoughtful and substantive commentary that I was glad to see in the film, but unfortunately this movie is just way too long. And every single interesting, substantive thought that could possibly be included in this film was already exhausted in half of the film's runtime. They would do something interesting, and then they would just do it again. I am not kidding when I say this film could easily cut out an hour of its runtime, maybe even 90 minutes. This is honestly one of the biggest issues I have with this film, because I genuinely did not give a shit about anything that was happening for about half of it. There were some interesting ideas and dynamics and conflicts, but when they're showing these things for the third time and they're not adding any new angles to it, it's really difficult for me to care. There is so much of this movie where they're essentially just showing us the exact same information, the exact same conflicts, the exact same dynamics, and it's like, great, you've covered this. Are you gonna do anything new with it? Are you gonna add anything to it? Or are you gonna just show us essentially the same thing again? If I'm watching a 3-hour movie, I want the length to be justified. There's a lot about this movie that I really enjoyed, but its length is making me not want to see it again. And I say this as someone who watches and appreciates films that are longer than this, but don't feel feel as long because they're more respectful with your time. I'd have to imagine that even this film's biggest fans can admit that there's plenty of room to trim it down. Sure, there's probably plenty of people that aren't going to feel the length as much as I did, but for me personally, the unbearably repetitive, time-wasting nature of this film is a big problem. This is yet another film where it feels as though a better version of it is somewhere in the editing room. Like I said, there's a lot of talented filmmaking within this film that I really loved, and I should also mention there was some genuinely incredible old age makeup near the end of the film. Really great stuff there, really fantastic production design, but damn, as much as I can acknowledge and appreciate all of these elements within the film, it doesn't really change the experience I had watching the film, and that experience was half impressed and half bored. So yeah, maybe this subject matter might be a bit more interesting to some people. Maybe that will help them not feel as bored as I was watching the film, and it wasn't entirely boring, just half boring, and the movie's 3 hours long, so that's like 90 minutes of being bored. So yeah, with all of that being considered, my rating is about as high as I could possibly give something with that description, and so I'm giving this one a 6 out of 10. Thank you. When we got into the theater for Barbie, it was a very different crowd. In Oppenheimer, everyone was completely silent and everyone was there to see the film in 70mm IMAX. But in Barbie, there were a bunch of people that were a little too chatty. There were clearly a number of people there that weren't really there to see the film, I guess. Some of them just went on their phones and were surfing random things on the internet for no reason. I guess they were bored or something. Maybe they have a problem. But despite having a worse audience for Barbie, I still very much enjoyed myself. After watching the 3-hour-long Oppenheimer in the same day, just going into any movie that is under 2 hours is a refreshing experience. I was full of energy and ready to take on the world. Now, the biggest reason why I was interested in this film is because it's a Greta Gerwig / Noah Baumbach film. They could have made a movie about another brand and I would have seen it either way, but I've got to say they really pulled this one off. This is a film that is very much self-aware and it knows exactly what it is. It's got a really fun tone with playful narration. The style and props and sets are all really interesting and engaging. This is a movie that is not afraid to be weird and different, and the exaggerated nature of this film is very much part of the joke. They don't even really try to make any sort of real explanation for the existence of Barbie Land. It knows that it's stupid, but it uses that towards its advantage rather than trying to hide it. There are some shots in Barbie Land with birds in the background that are obviously very fake. There's also a chase scene in the film where the actors are really obviously not trying to look as though they're actually running. They essentially do this dumb fake running thing that feels like it would be appropriate in a Tim and Eric sketch. I love how much this movie leans into its own absurdity, and I love how, for the most part, it's pretty unpretentious. Sure, there are moments and sequences in this film where, let's just say, it gets a little preachy in a literal sense. Honestly, there was one scene where I could tell people were going to clap at the end of it, and they did. This movie is unsurprisingly pretty feminist, and so obviously with Greta Gerwig both writing and directing this film, it was bound to include much of the female perspective. And sure, the way it was expressed in this film could definitely be more subtle, but this wasn't really the needlessly divisive, man-hating movie that some are interpreting this film as. And believe me, as a film festival goer who consumes a lot of independent films, there are definitely writers whose films come across as though they've had a really bad experience with men in their lives and therefore think that all men are bad. Like, yeah, I get it, most people suck, but to pretend as though that's a gendered issue is needlessly divisive. But Barbie doesn't feel like one of those movies. Greta Gerwig is a woman, so of course she's going to share what she feels are struggles from the female perspective. And even though this film is fairly unsubtle about how it expresses these perspectives, there was a surprising amount of nuance found for those paying attention. It didn't come off as a film that was just pointing at men the whole time saying, "Ah, you're so bad for oppressing us." The film expressed commentary on what is typically considered to be male behavior, but there was also commentary and criticism on what is typically considered to be female behavior. And pretty much all of it felt lighthearted and playful and tongue-in-cheek. Like, the entire Barbies versus Kens conflict is just so silly, and even in its dramatic conflict moments, it doesn't really pretend to be all that serious. serious. And that's exactly what this movie needed to be. Just a fun, visually stimulating movie with good choices that you don't need to take too seriously. What's interesting about this movie is that it is PG-13, so it's very much not for little children, even if some people decided to bring them to the theater for no reason. There were also quite a few jokes aimed explicitly at millennials. There were lots of comedically recognizable songs in the soundtrack that were also just there for millennials. This movie does a really great job at creating something that at points feels nostalgic, but that's not the entire point of the film. It is so much more substantive than so many other films that seem to only exist just to be like, remember this, remember that, remember berries?
Remember TIE fighters? Oh, remember Jawas?
I'm really glad that this project went to Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach, because Amy Schumer's version probably would have been very, very bad. The acting in this film was overall very good, and sorry ladies, but Ryan Gosling completely steals the show on this one. I would honestly love to see him act in more comedic roles, because there is just so much from his performance alone that really added to the comedic value of this film. There's this kind of fake Chad laugh that he does a couple times in the film. It almost sounds like Tommy Wiseau. He did a really fantastic job with this character, and he was an absolute blast to watch. Margot Robbie worked great as the lead, and she was really well cast for the role. And surprisingly, Will Ferrell's involvement did not make me want to claw my own eyes out. He was well used in the film, he very much fit the tone, and he wasn't doing an annoying man-baby screaming thing the whole time, so it was great. All in all, I had a really positive experience with this movie. Before watching either of these films, I was honestly expecting Oppenheimer to be the better one, but Barbie was a pleasant surprise that I will definitely be watching again. So yeah, check this one out. It was pretty dank, and I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. Thank you.